I never expected the woods to feel this alive. It's suffocating, really. I'd spent years in crowded cities, surrounded by constant motion and noise, but nothing ever felt this pressing. The silence here isn't still. It breathes, it waits. The trees tower over the cabin like ancient sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the sky, blotting out the late afternoon light. As the hours tick by, I'm aware of every sound, every movement. Even the smallest creak of the cabin settling makes me jump. I'd been driving for hours before I arrived. The roads grew narrower and narrower until there was barely a path left, just dense forest threatening to swallow me whole. My father had always been a private man, too private, I now realize. I can't recall him ever taking us here. My childhood was spent visiting him in his crumbling house in the suburbs, far from this lonely place. I decided to come here after his funeral. Something had gnawed at me as I watched the casket lower into the ground, a weight I couldn't shake. There were no tears, no outpouring of grief, but a gnawing curiosity. My father had lived here for years away from everything. The lawyer told me there were important documents I needed to handle, but that wasn't it. I couldn't stand the thought of this place just sitting out here, untouched after everything. Now I regret that decision. It didn't take long for the unease to settle in. When I first unlocked the front door, the air was thick with dust, old and stale, like the cabin had been untouched for years. There was a faint smell of damp wood and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off as the scent of decay, a structure left to rot. Inside, everything was exactly as he left it. A small kitchen cluttered with dishes, a living room with faded furniture, and a single bedroom down the hall. I should feel more at ease, knowing I'm surrounded by my father's things. But it's all wrong. The shadows are too long, and the house is too quiet. No humming refrigerator or ticking clocks. Just silence. The first night was when it began. I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. to the softest sound, like whispering, barely audible, but constant. It crept under the door from the hallway, threading through the cracks in the walls. My heart raced as I strained to listen, but it was impossible to make out any words. I lay there for what felt like hours, gripping the sheets, paralyzed by a fear that made no sense. Eventually it stopped just as it started abruptly. I told myself it was the wind in the trees, maybe the creaking of the old wooden beams. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts were racing, replaying the whispering in my head, the way it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The next morning, I stepped outside, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the light filtering through the trees was enough to remind me that the world was still turning. I inhaled deeply, trying to push the eerie memories of the night away. Maybe I was just on edge, mourning, or maybe it was the exhaustion of the long drive. The clearing around the cabin was serene, the kind of peaceful my father would have loved. Tall pine trees bordered the open space, and the dense forest beyond made it feel like the cabin was cocooned from the rest of the world. No cars, no voices, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But even in the daylight, something felt off. I spent most of the day cleaning, sorting through the clutter. I found old notebooks scattered across the house, some filled with mundane observations, weather patterns, inventory lists, but there was one that was different. It was a leather-bound journal, stuffed between two old books on the shelf. Its pages were worn, the ink smudged, as if written in haste. I opened it, and as I read, my heart sank. June 12th. The whispering started again last night. I swear I could hear it inside the walls, though I'm certain I locked every door, checked every window. I need to stop listening for it, but it's impossible to ignore. They say the mind plays tricks in isolation, but this feels too deliberate, too directed. June 16th. I saw it again today, just beyond the tree line, standing still as death. It watches me every night now, though it never moves. I'm not going mad. I'm not imagining it. There's something out there, something that's always been here. June 21st. I thought I saw someone or something outside the cabin. It was so tall, so thin, standing motionless among the trees. It was just standing there, watching me. watching the house. When I opened the door, it was gone. The entries went on like that, growing more frantic, more paranoid. At first, he seemed calm, even scientific, documenting every detail. But as the entries went on, his handwriting changed, became more erratic, almost illegible, scrawled in large, uneven letters. He started writing about the figure as though it were part of the landscape, part of the woods themselves. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead as I reached the final entry. July 1st. I can't stay here any longer. They're inside the walls now. I hear them at night, crawling and scratching. The figure's no longer outside. It's in here with me. They found me. That night, I made sure every door was locked, every window latched, but the sense of dread only grew heavier. I slept fitfully, waking up every hour, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway. The whispers returned, louder than before. I could hear them more clearly now, like voices speaking just out of earshot. I strained to make out the words, but they were too soft, too distorted. Then around 3 a.m., I saw it, the tall figure just beyond the clearing, standing completely still watching the cabin. I don't remember how long I stared at it, frozen in place. The darkness clung to its form, making it impossible to see any details. It was just a silhouette, impossibly tall and thin, barely visible against the trees. It never moved, never came closer, but it knew I was watching. I slammed the window shut and locked it, heart racing. The journal entries echoed in my mind. I'm not imagining it. There's something out there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every noise, every creak, sent a jolt of terror through me. I paced the cabin, checking the locks again and again. The figure didn't reappear, but I knew it was still out there, watching. The next morning, I was more exhausted than I'd ever been. My nerves were frayed, my muscles tight with tension. I needed to get out of this place, needed to leave before whatever was out there got any closer. But something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that my father's last days were tied to this place, that he had uncovered something beyond mere madness. I spent the day reading more of the journal, trying to make sense of his ramblings. The pages were filled with strange drawings, symbols I didn't recognize, crude sketches of the figure outside, all of them scrawled with trembling hands. One page was stained, as though he'd been crying while writing it. The words were jumbled, disconnected. It's in the walls. They're waiting. They want me to join them. The cabin had become a prison. The silence was too loud, the shadows too deep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even in broad daylight. Something was always watching, always just out of sight. That night, the whispers returned again. Louder, closer. I lay in bed, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to happen. The whispers grew, rising and falling like a strange chant. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the sound crawled into my mind, echoing from every corner of the cabin. I knew deep down that the figure would return, and this time it wouldn't stay outside. I don't know how much time passed before I finally slept. When I awoke, it was still dark outside, and my body felt weighed down by exhaustion, like I hadn't slept at all. The air in the cabin was thick, oppressive, and for a moment, I thought the whispers might have followed me into my dreams. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid to leave the bed. I lay there, my heart pounding in the silence. Every shadow in the room stretched unnaturally long. It felt like the darkness itself was reaching for me. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that I was stressed, but my father's journal kept gnawing at the back of my mind. I had read every word, every frantic scrawl. He had written about seeing things outside the windows at night, of hearing voices. He had been convinced that something was after him, but it was just paranoia, right? I got up slowly, feeling the weight of the cabin's stillness pressing down on me. I went to the window and looked out into the clearing. For a brief second, I expected to see the figure standing there again, but the clearing was empty. Empty but wrong. The trees seemed darker, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. There was no wind, but the leaves seemed to shiver, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should, creeping along the edge of the clearing as if waiting for something. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. The woods were different now, darker, more malevolent. I needed to leave. The thought struck me suddenly, an urgent voice in the back of my mind. I needed to pack my things, get in the car, and drive back to the city. This cabin was wrong. I threw on my clothes and started packing. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. The house felt like it was breathing, like the walls themselves were pulsing with some unseen energy. Halfway through packing, I found something else. It was wedged between the dresser and the wall. Another notebook. This one was smaller, older, the leather cover cracked and worn. My father's name was scribbled on the inside cover, but the handwriting wasn't frantic like in the other journals. This was neater, almost careful. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it, skimming the first few pages. They were filled with notes, diagrams, even strange symbols. He had written about the cabin's construction, the materials used, but something in the details seemed off. He had been meticulous, almost obsessed with the architecture of the cabin. Then I found it, the entry that chilled me to my core. May 4th. I found the crawl space today. I've lived here for years, but I never noticed it before. The trapdoor was hidden beneath the old rug in the bedroom. How did I miss it? I opened it, but something inside told me not to go down. The air felt too cold, too still, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. There was a smell too, faint but distinct, like something rotting. May 7th. I couldn't stop thinking about the crawl space. Every night, I hear it now, something moving beneath the floorboards, a soft scratching sound that never stops. I tried to ignore it, but it's there all the time. I finally went down into the crawl space today. It was dark, too dark. I took a flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the blackness. The space seemed to stretch further than it should have, like it was bigger on the inside than on the outside. And the smell? That terrible smell. May 9th. There's something down there. I don't know what it is, but I feel it watching me. It doesn't come out during the day, but at night I can hear it moving. It scratches at the floorboards, whispering to me. I can't stay here anymore. My hands were shaking as I closed the notebook. The crawl space. I had seen the rug in the bedroom, the one he mentioned, but I had no idea there was a trapdoor underneath. My gut twisted at the thought of it. Was this all in his head? Had he really heard something? Or was he just losing his grip on reality? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. But the worst part, the part that sent a chill up my spine, was the realization that I had heard the same scratching last night. I stood there in the center of the bedroom, staring at the rug, the last of the fading daylight casting long shadows across the floor. The room was filled with an almost tangible stillness, a silence so deep it felt like sound itself had been swallowed by the cabin. I didn't want to pull the rug back, but I had to know if the crawl space was real. I had to know if the journal was just the ramblings of a madman, or if my father had discovered something horrifying. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of the rug. Slowly, I pulled it back, revealing the worn, wooden floorboards beneath. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. The trapdoor. It was small, no more than a few feet wide, and it was sealed with rusted iron latches. The floor beneath me felt colder now, as if the air from below was seeping through the cracks. I hesitated, listening, half expecting to hear the scratching my father had written about. But there was only silence. I knelt there for what felt like an eternity, debating whether I should open it. My mind raced with questions. What was down there? What had driven my father to madness? And more importantly, what was it about this place that felt so wrong? I gripped the latches and slowly, cautiously, pulled them open. The old hinges creaked as the door lifted, revealing a gaping black void beneath the floor. The smell hit me immediately, faint but unmistakable. The stench of rot. I held my breath and peered into the darkness, my flashlight in hand. The beam barely penetrated the blackness, and I realized the crawl space was much deeper than I had expected. My father's words came back to me. It's bigger on the inside than the outside. I swung my legs over the edge and lowered myself into the crawl space. The air was thick, heavy, and the deeper I went, the colder it became. I landed on something soft, dirt, maybe, but it was too dark to see clearly. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the space. It wasn't just a crawl space. It was a tunnel, narrow and low, like something had burrowed beneath the house. The walls were lined with strange symbols, carved into the dirt, etched into the beams. Some of the symbols were the same ones I'd seen in my father's journals, but others were unfamiliar, more intricate, and disturbing. I took a few steps forward, the tunnel narrowing as I moved. My breathing was shallow, the sound of my own footsteps too loud in the silence. And then I heard it, the scratching. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable, like nails scraping against wood. My heart pounded as I shined the light ahead, but there was nothing, only darkness. The scratching grew louder. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing. Just the tunnel, empty and dark. The scratching continued, now from above inside the walls. My mind was racing, my body frozen in fear. I couldn't move, couldn't think, only listen to the sound as it grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence was deafening. I took a shaky step back, my body trembling with fear. I needed to get out of there, needed to get back to the cabin. I turned, ready to climb out of the crawl space, when I heard it, just behind me, a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. A voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My heart raced as I felt the presence of something unseen, but undeniably there. I ran. I scrambled out of the crawl space, pulling myself up and slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread remained, heavy and suffocating. I backed away from the trapdoor, my body trembling as I pressed myself against the wall. The room was silent now, but I knew it wouldn't last. Whatever was down there, whatever was inside the walls, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the cabin sent a jolt of terror through me. The whispers were back, louder now, more insistent. They seeped through the walls, threading through my mind, twisting my thoughts. I kept thinking about the symbols, the carvings in the tunnel, and the way they seemed to hum with energy. My father had written about them, about their purpose, but the details were vague, fragmented. I needed to find more, needed to understand what had happened to him. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't alone. Something was here, something in the cabin, and it was getting closer. Tomorrow, I would leave. I spent the entire morning pacing the small living room, trying to convince myself to leave, to just get in the car and drive away. But every time I packed my things, something stopped me. My thoughts were muddled, my mind clouded with doubt. Leaving felt like a betrayal, as though I were abandoning my father's memory and all the unanswered questions. It was absurd, but I couldn't shake it. The crawl space still lingered in my mind, its stench, the strange carvings, and most of all, the whispers. They'd followed me into my dreams, twisted and fragmented, like echoes of something terrible hiding just beneath the surface. Even in daylight, I could still hear them faintly, buried beneath the sounds of the wind in the trees. I needed answers. By afternoon, I'd gone through more of my father's journals. Most were filled with ramblings, long, disjointed entries about the cabin and the woods surrounding it. He wrote of seeing things at night, the same figure I'd glimpsed. But as I read further, his tone changed. The writing became more erratic, more desperate, as though he had come to some terrible realization. In one journal, I found a passage that struck me like a physical blow. June 23rd, I saw them again today. They were standing at the edge of the woods, watching the cabin. I can't tell if they're human anymore. They look like people, distant, distorted, but they don't move like us. They don't blink. I don't know why they haven't come closer, but I know they're waiting for something. I read the passage over and over, the words burrowing deep into my mind. He had seen them, the figures, not just the one I'd seen outside the window, but more, and he had been terrified. Were these the same things that whispered at night? The ones scratching in the walls? I felt cold fear creeping up my spine. What were they waiting for? I left the house and walked to the edge of the clearing, just as my father had written about. The sunlight, filtering through the trees, cast long, ominous shadows. The woods felt too still, too quiet, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I kept walking, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The further I went, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The trees loomed above me like towering skeletons, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. I stopped at the edge of the forest, just where the clearing ended and the dense trees began. For a long moment, I stood there listening, waiting. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe I hoped the figure would appear again, and I could finally confront whatever had been haunting me. But nothing happened. The woods remained still, the shadows long and dark. I turned back toward the cabin, but that's when I saw it, movement at the corner of my vision. I snapped my head around, and there, just barely visible between the trees, was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette shifting and blending with the shadows. It stood perfectly still, watching me from the cover of the forest. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't alone. More figures began to emerge from the darkness, their forms barely visible in the thick undergrowth. There were at least 4, maybe 5 of them, all standing in a line, spaced evenly apart, watching the clearing. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. They were too far to make out any details, but their presence was unmistakable. It was like the air around them had thickened, growing heavy with dread. I wanted to scream, to run back to the cabin and lock myself inside, but my legs refused to move. The figures stood there, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on them, and hurried back to the cabin. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, bolted it, but it didn't matter. They weren't trying to get in, at least not yet. I collapsed onto the couch, my chest heaving, my mind racing. The journals had warned me. My father had written about them, but I hadn't believed it. I told myself he was paranoid, losing his grip on reality. But now I knew. They were real, and they were watching me, just like they had watched him. The hours passed slowly, dragging into the late afternoon. I couldn't stop thinking about the figures in the woods, about the way they stood there, unmoving, unblinking. Were they waiting for nightfall? Was that when they would come? I tried to distract myself by going through more of the journals, but every passage I read seemed to echo my own thoughts. My father's fear mirrored my own, and I felt a creeping sense of inevitability, like I was following in his footsteps, walking the same path that had led to his death. I wasn't sure I wanted to keep reading, but something in the final journal caught my attention. It wasn't written in the same frantic tone as the others. Instead, it was calm, almost resigned, as though he had accepted his fate. July 3rd. It's not the cabin they want. It's not even me. They're waiting for someone to replace me. Someone to stay here, to listen to them, to be watched. This place, it's a trap. It's been waiting for someone else to take my place. My blood ran cold as I read the words. It was a trap, and now I had fallen into it. I stood up, pacing the room. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. Immediately. My father's warnings were clear. This cabin wasn't meant to be lived in, and the figures weren't just harmless ghosts or hallucinations. They were real, and they had a purpose. But before I could act, there was a knock at the door. I froze. It was soft, tentative, as if someone outside was trying not to disturb me. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the door. For a moment, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. The knock came again, a soft thud, thud, thud against the wood. I leaned forward, pressing my ear to the door, listening. There was a voice, muffled, faint. Hello? Is someone there? I felt a sudden wave of relief. It wasn't one of them. The voice was human, normal, someone who had stumbled onto the property by accident, maybe a hiker or a neighbor. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek outside. Standing on the porch was a man, mid-30s, with a weathered face and tired eyes. He was dressed in hiking gear, a backpack slung over his shoulder, and his clothes were dirty, as if he'd been walking for hours. "Hey," he said, his voice wary. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm kind of lost. My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been trying to find help." I opened the door a bit wider, relief flooding through me. He was just a hiker, someone who had wandered too far into the woods. Maybe I was being paranoid after all. "Come in," I said. "You're welcome to rest for a bit." He stepped inside, grateful, and dropped his backpack by the door. "Thanks, man. You have no idea how long I've been walking." I offered him water and something to eat, trying to keep the conversation casual. But my mind was still racing. What if they had sent him? What if this was part of their plan to trap me here? The man sat down at the table, looking around the cabin. "This place is pretty remote. You live here full-time?" "No," I replied, my voice shaky. "I'm just visiting. It belonged to my father." He nodded, though something in his expression shifted. His gaze lingered on the windows, the walls, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen anything strange outside, if he'd noticed the figures. But I was afraid of how he might react. What if he thought I was crazy? What if he already knew? "Actually," I began, my voice low, "I've been seeing things. In the woods. At night." His head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing. "What kind of things?" I swallowed, unsure if I should say more. "Figures. People. Watching the house." His face paled. He stood up abruptly, glancing toward the door. "I should get going." "What? Why?" "I've seen them too." My blood ran cold. The man didn't explain further. He just grabbed his backpack and bolted for the door, leaving me standing there, confused and terrified. I wanted to call after him, to ask him what he knew, but he was already gone, disappearing into the woods. As the door slammed shut behind him, I felt the cabin's oppressive silence return. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching toward me like claws. I locked the door, bolting it shut, my hands trembling. I didn't know what he had seen, or how long he had been watching them, but his fear was palpable. The sun was setting now, and I knew that nightfall would bring more than just whispers. It would bring the visitors. The man was gone. His frantic departure left the air thick with unspoken fear. I stood at the door, staring out into the fading light of the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No sound of footsteps receding into the distance. Just the darkening woods swallowing the last of the day. The oppressive silence was back, heavier than ever. I slammed the door and bolted it again, my mind spinning. "I've seen them too." The words echoed in my head, over and over. The terror in his eyes had been real. He had seen the same figures, and whatever he knew, it was enough to send him running. If he had answers, I'd never know them now. He had left me here, alone, with them. I stood in the center of the cabin, the walls closing in around me, the shadows stretching impossibly long across the floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight. I had seen the figures in the woods during the day, but now that night was falling, I knew they'd be back. Closer. I grabbed my father's final journal and leafed through the pages, desperate for something I might have missed. Something that could explain what was happening. His words blurred as my mind raced, but I forced myself to slow down, to read carefully. June 29th. I saw them again last night, standing at the edge of the clearing. There are more of them now. They don't move, but I know they're watching. I know they're waiting for something. I can feel it in the way the air thickens when they're near, like the world itself is holding its breath. June 30th. They're not people. I know that now. They look human, but there's something wrong with them. The way they stand, the way they watch, they're too still, too unnatural. Like they're wearing a mask of flesh over something else. Something darker. July 1st. I can't leave. I've tried, but every time I get to the car, I feel it. The pull. Something's keeping me here. I don't know if it's the cabin or the figures, but they don't want me to leave. It's a trap, and I've walked right into it. July 3rd. I hear them in the walls now. I thought it was the wind at first, but it's not. They're inside the house, inside the very structure. They're always watching, always waiting. And soon, they'll come for me. The journal slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. My father had known. He had understood what was happening far before I did. The figures weren't just watching. They were waiting for the right moment. And when they decided it was time, they'd come inside. I looked around the cabin. Every creak and groan of the old wood sending jolts of terror through me. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. The silence was too thick, too present. I could hear the faintest sounds, just beneath the edge of my hearing, like whispers woven into the fabric of the house itself. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and I felt a sharp drop in the temperature. The sun had set fully now, and the cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of a single lamp I had turned on earlier. The light seemed weak, feeble, like it barely held the shadows at bay. I went to the windows, pulling the curtains shut, locking every door, checking the latches on the windows. My hands trembled as I worked, the fear gripping me tighter with every passing second. The figure outside was the least of my worries now. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone anymore. That night, the scratching began again. It was faint at first, like the sound of branches brushing against the side of the cabin. But as the hours wore on, it grew louder, more insistent. I could hear it in the walls, just like my father had written. Something was moving behind the wood, crawling through the very structure of the house. The whispers followed, soft, unintelligible, but they grew louder as well. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the walls, from the floorboards, from the ceiling. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, waiting for it to open on its own. My mind was unraveling, my thoughts racing in a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. Every sound, every shadow, made me jump. I was terrified that the figures would break through the walls at any moment. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone tapping gently on the outside of the house. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The knocking continued, a steady thud, thud, thud against the wood, coming from the direction of the front door. But it wasn't just there. It started at the back of the house, too, then the sides, until it seemed like the entire cabin was surrounded by knocking. I ran to the front window and yanked the curtain aside, peering out into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. They were there. The figures stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. There were more of them now, dozens. They were closer than before, their thin, distorted bodies barely visible in the dim light. And they were watching, but they didn't move. They just stood there. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was outside was trying to break in. My mind raced with panic. There was no way out. I was trapped, just like my father had been. I ran to the back door, thinking maybe I could make a break for the car. But the moment I reached for the handle, the scratching inside the walls grew louder, sharper. It was right there, just inches away from me, like something was trying to claw its way out of the walls. The whispers grew more intense, almost frantic, like they were trying to speak to me, trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave either. I don't know how long I paced the room, trying to figure out what to do. My mind felt fractured, barely holding onto reality. I could still hear the knocking, the scratching, the voices. They were all around me, pressing in from every side. At some point, I found myself standing in the bedroom again, staring at the trapdoor to the crawl space. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, but there was something else now. A pressure, a weight, like the house itself was holding its breath. I could feel it pulsing through the walls, through the floor. The whispers had become a steady drone, a low hum that vibrated in my bones. And beneath it all, I could hear the sound of something breathing. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. My father had written about this, about the pull he felt to the crawl space, about how the air grew colder the closer he got, about how something waited for him down there. And now it was waiting for me. I didn't want to open the trapdoor again, but my body moved on its own. I was terrified, but I had to know. I had to see it, to confront whatever had driven my father to madness. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I reached for the latch. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I pulled the latch open, and the trapdoor creaked, revealing the black void beneath. The smell hit me instantly, the stench of rot and decay. It was stronger now, more pungent, like something alive was festering down there. I hesitated, staring into the darkness, but something in the back of my mind urged me forward. I lowered myself into the crawl space, the cold air wrapping around me like a vice. I could barely see, but I didn't need to. The tunnel stretched out in front of me, impossibly long, impossibly dark. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with some kind of dark energy. The whispers were deafening now. They came from all around me, speaking in that strange, guttural language. I could feel them inside my head, twisting my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the tunnel. I moved forward, my body trembling, my heart racing. I didn't want to go any further, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was pulling me, dragging me toward the end of the tunnel. And then I saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, there was a figure, tall and thin, its body warped and twisted in ways that defied logic. It stood perfectly still, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my skin. I froze. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, the world went silent. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its presence. It was inside my head, inside my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. Then, slowly, the figure raised its hand and pointed at me. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, like my heart had been pierced by ice. I gasped for breath, my body convulsing. The world around me darkened, and I fell to my knees, the breath knocked out of me. As my vision faded, I heard the whispers again, louder this time, closer. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were inside me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I grabbed the figure's wrist, yanking it away from my forehead. The moment our skin parted, the vision shattered like glass. I gasped, my mind reeling, but I could feel my body again, my own body. I stumbled backward, the room tilting and spinning as I fought to stay upright. The figures recoiled, their hollow eyes fixed on me, as if I had broken some unspoken rule. Their movements became erratic, their forms shifting and distorting, flickering in and out of the shadows like faulty projections. The whispers returned, louder now, desperate, angry. They clawed at my thoughts, trying to pull me back under. But I wasn't listening anymore. I ran for the door, my legs shaky and weak. The cabin groaned and creaked around me. The very walls seemed to bend, reaching for me, but I kept moving. I threw open the door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap, and stumbled out into the clearing. Behind me, I could feel the presence of the figures, watching from the shadows of the cabin. But they didn't follow. They couldn't leave. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. Fumbling with the keys, I got inside and slammed the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind me. I never went back. I don't know what became of the cabin after I fled, and I don't care. Whatever evil lurks there, it's trapped in that place, waiting for the next person who's foolish enough to stay. Maybe it'll claim them like it almost claimed me. Maybe it'll go on waiting forever. But I know one thing for sure. The last time I looked in the rearview mirror as I sped away, I saw them. Those figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching, and they were smiling.